Have you ever felt like you were drowning? That no matter what you did, you just couldn't find anything to keep you afloat? I never thought much about the physical act of drowning until I read The Perfect Storm by Sebastian Junger. It was later made into a movie, but as is the case, I think, with many situations, the book was better. Part of the book that really stuck with me, that haunted me for months afterward, that still 20 years after I first read it stays with me, is the description he gave of drowning. He writes, "The water comes up so hard and fast that they can't even think. They're up to their waists, and then their chests, and then their chins, and then there's no air at all, just what's in their lungs, a minute's worth or so. The instinct not to breathe underwater is so strong that it overcomes the agony of running out of air. No matter how desperate the drowning person is, he doesn't inhale until he's on the verge of losing consciousness. At that point, there's so much carbon dioxide in the blood and so little oxygen that chemical sensors in the brain trigger an involuntary breath, whether he's underwater or not. That is called the break point. Until the break point, a drowning person is said to be undergoing voluntary apnea, choosing not to breathe. Lack of oxygen to the brain causes a sensation of darkness closing in from all sides, as in a camera aperture stopping down. The panic of a drowning person is mixed with an odd incredulity that this is actually happening. Having never done it before, the body and the mind do not know how to process it, how to die gracefully. The process is filled with desperation and awkwardness. So this is drowning, a drowning person might think. So this is how my life finally ends. He goes on from there to describe in excruciating detail the scientific and technical aspects of drowning, which I will spare us from this morning. But the main point is that drowning is awful. It is scary. It is overwhelming to think about and read about, let alone to actually have to experience. Thank God I've never been in danger of physically drowning. But there have certainly been times that because of what has been going on in my life, I felt like the water was rising around me and I was just kind of thrashing around without a place to put my feet on solid ground or a life raft to grab and hold on to. My guess is that you've felt that way at times too. And it's from that place that the psalmist speaks. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and the flood sweeps over me. We're in our third week on our series on the Psalms. Our first two Psalms, Psalm 1 and Psalm 113, were what are called Psalms of orientation. They focused on equilibrium and coherence. But we know from our own experience that life is not always like that. There is so much disequilibrium and incoherence. I mean, just look around. That's sort of the definition of what we're living through right now. And I think that's led many of us to feel like we're drowning, to feel despair. I was listening recently to Brene Brown's new podcast called Unlocking Us, and she was interviewing author Austen Channing Brown, and they were talking about despair. And Brene talked about how one definition of despair that she's heard is the fear that tomorrow will be just like today. Despair is the fear that tomorrow will be just like today. And I think that's what many of us are feeling, right? With this pandemic, with civil unrest, with economic uncertainty, just the sense of, like, is this ever going to change? And the thing is, the Bible doesn't sugarcoat that disequilibrium and incoherence and despair, especially in the Psalms, 1/3 of which are considered psalms of lament, songs that cry out to God in the midst of trouble. Unfortunately, the church hasn't always known what to do with these psalms. We've mostly just ignored them. For those of you who have hung around the Lutheran church for a while, you may remember the old green hymnal, the Lutheran Book of Worship. And there was a lot to be commended in that resource, but one major criticism is that the section that has the Psalms printed in them, they omitted a great deal of the Psalms. They only printed the ones that were appointed to be read in worship. And you can guess probably what type of psalm was most likely to be omitted. These psalms, psalms of disorientation, the ones that speak to the reality of pain and suffering and injustice in the world. More in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause. Many are those who would destroy me, my enemies who accuse me falsely. All too often, the church has continued to sing happy songs of orientation as though blind and deaf to all the times in our lives when it sure does appear that God is not in control. When the bottom falls out, when the loneliness sinks in, when the right path forward is completely obscured. Perhaps we in the church are scared to acknowledge that these times exist because it seems like maybe we're giving up on God, not trusting God, not believing in God. Perhaps these cries out to God, challenging God to act, criticizing his apparent silence, perhaps they seem too much to us, like an act of unfaith. But what these psalms of disorientation teach us is that these cries to God are anything but unfaith. In fact, it is an act of bold faith to say that nothing is out of the purview of God, that the darkness in our lives must be acknowledged and its truth spoken before God. Our lives must be experienced as they are really, and not in some pretend way that's all puppies and rainbows. And so to take that pain and suffering and hold it up before God and yell, "Where the heck are you?" That's actually a brave cry of faith. It's saying nothing is too big or too deep or too awful for God. I am weary with crying. My throat is parched. My eyes grow dim with waiting for my God. Laments show us that God actually encourages us to do this sort of thing. To say, as Walter Brueggemann puts it, you are not acting like the kind of God you say you are. What a powerful statement, ultimately rooted in faith. Faith that there is a God to hear our complaints and our big feelings. Faith that this God is big enough to receive them and transform them. Our world tends to encourage us to stuff those big feelings. I mean, what do we normally say when people ask us how we're doing, right? We normally say, "Oh, I'm fine." We know that it's not socially okay to respond when someone says, "How are you?" To say, "Actually, my world is falling apart and I'm not sure that God is here." But the Psalms teach us how to move into the presence of God with things that are not polite or civil, things that are gut-wrenching and awful and overwhelming. And they give us words that at times may seem scandalous, but nevertheless must be brought to God, who is Lord of all human experience, and partner with us in it. Insults have broken my heart so that I am in despair. I looked for pity, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none. Sometimes when we read these Psalms, we can find comfort in the fact that we are not alone in our feelings, that there are those who have gone before us who have experienced pain big enough to warrant these strong words. Just knowing that there are others who have gone through these tough times and made it through on the other side, that can be a relief. But other times, it's not enough. Sometimes the pain has cut through us too deeply. Sometimes we need more than just the knowledge in our head that others have been to this place. Sometimes the waters are getting so deep and the sensation of darkness closing in around us is so powerful that we desperately need the light of hope to shine through, to tell us that this isn't the end of the story, that God not only hears, but transforms this pain. The interesting thing about this psalm for today, Psalm 69, is that parts of it show up all over the New Testament, mostly as words on the lips of Jesus. In Jesus, God becomes human, and God experiences the totality of what it means to be human, even and most especially the pain and suffering in this world. In Jesus, God comes to know what it feels like to experience God's own absence. So then, if God takes on the fullness of what it means to be human, if in Jesus God embodies all of the pain and the brokenness of life and this world, then that becomes the very thing that God promises to redeem and transform and make new. In the midst of the darkness that you experience in this world, God's promise to you is that nothing you experience is outside the realm of God's saving work. Nothing. Not even God's own absence. In the midst of that promise, we can find the courage to stand in the darkness, even when it seems as though the waters are closing in around us. With your faithful help, rescue me from sinking in the mire. Let me be delivered from my enemies and from the deep waters. Do not let the flood sweep over me, or the deep swallow me up, or the pit close its mouth over me. Amen.